Great. Okay. Good evening. Thank you for coming. With this class, we conclude the four-part series, Jewish Tradition and the Other. We've looked at Talmudic texts, rabbinic texts on how the rabbis navigated their understanding of various others in their world. We looked at Jewish philosophical perspectives on the phenomenon of other religions and different groupings of ways of thinking about that. We looked at questions of interfaith dialogue specifically, and we also heard Rabbi Reese speak about entering churches, which is also very relevant to this theme. And now we're going to talk about another kind of way in which this question kind of percolates, and that's the question of interdenominational interactions from an Orthodox perspective. And the truth is, this also could be, if this was a history class, this could be, to be a semester, on just that topic. That is, in fact, the history of Orthodoxy as an intellectual movement, as a community over the last 200 years, is the story of interdenominational interactions and how Orthodoxy has defined itself. Maybe that's a good place just to start, to point out that Orthodoxy, I've said this before, maybe not to you, but I've said it here even, Orthodoxy is a reaction to the Reform movement, okay? Orthodoxy doesn't exist until there is such a thing as the Reform movement. Before that, there was just traditional Judaism, which is distinct from Orthodoxy in a number of ways. Traditional Judaism isn't self-conscious. Traditional Judaism is sort of an unself-conscious perpetuation of a traditional culture. Orthodoxy is a phenomenon of modernity. It's Jews who have options, who choose to maintain their traditions in an Orthodox fashion. And it's only possible to be Orthodox if there are alternatives. And so the Reform movement is the first movement, denomination to form in Central Europe, in Germany. In the 19th century, it spreads to America, also in the 19th century, becomes very dominant in America in the mid-19th century after the 1848 failure of the 1848 revolutions in Central Europe. A lot of German Jews come to America and bring Reform Judaism to America, I don't think I need to sort of explain what Reform Judaism is, but belief in ethical monotheism as the core element of the Jewish faith, and therefore ritual mitzvot are seen as being optional, or being even worse than optional, less than optional, being outdated and outmoded and irrelevant, and barriers to full integration into the modern world. And the conservative movement has a more complicated origin. The better histories of the conservative movement, the more recent ones, point out that the conservative movement really doesn't exist until the 1940s as a distinct movement. There are, the various institutions of conservative Judaism can trace themselves back much further, but as a distinct movement, distinct from Orthodoxy, distinct from Reform, it doesn't exist until America in the late 1940s. Okay, so let's. I don't think it's really necessary to understand this topic to really have have a clear definition of what those other movements necessarily stand for and advocate. I think it's enough to say that they're different in practice and in belief, and the Orthodox thinkers and the Orthodox community has had to figure out how to respond. Okay, first source is Samuel Hirsch. This is his commentary on Deuteronomy. Samuel Hirsch was the one who is sort of seen as saving Orthodoxy in Frankfurt. Germany was the birthplace of the Reform movement. The German Jewish community was dominated by Reform already by the middle of the 19th century, by the 1860s certainly. And Samuel Hirsch comes to Germany from Hungary. He's one of the earliest Orthodox rabbis to have a college degree. He comes to eventually advocate something that's known as neo-Orthodoxy. That's Orthodoxy with an appreciation and embrace of culture and sort of being part of general culture. He loved German literature and German culture. And he wrote a commentary on the Torah, which is excellent. And here's what he says. This is in commentary to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. Every other nation becomes a nation by virtue of the fact that it has a land of its own. Only after that does it create its own laws to be observed in the land. You, by contrast, became a nation solely by virtue of your law. and were given a land of your own solely for the purpose that you may observe that law. The law is constant. You and the land are the variables. The law is not obliged to change in accordance with changes in your fortunes or in the fortunes of your land. It is your fortunes and the fortunes of your land that will change in accordance with the extent to which you will be loyal to the law. It is with the law in your arms that you now stand as a nation on the border of the land you are to enter, in order that you may there observe the law in its entirety. And even in days to come, when you have forfeited the land, albeit temporarily, you will appear again and again as that nation which has no other calling but to live for the observance of this law, and to await the moment when you will be able once again to enter the land which was given to you, so that you may observe the law in its entirety. You are the people of the law. Eretz Yisrael is the land of the law, but you are not the Palestinian people, and Eretz Yisrael is not the Jewish land. Okay? The only thing that is essential is the Torah and our connection to the Torah. Land, Eretz Yisrael, that's not our land. It's not. We are, Jews are to Eretz Yisrael, not like, Norwegians are to Norway. Okay, Norwegians are the people of Norway. We are not the people of Eretz Yisrael. Our connection to Eretz Yisrael is conditional. Okay, we're not a nation that emerges from a land like every other nation, that has an organic tie to its land like every other nation. We are a nation that is created by and defined by our connection to the Torah. Okay, so I like, I think it's a very powerful comment about this essential nature of our connection to the Torah, the eternal, notion, the eternality, right, of our allegiance to Torah. And he's contrasting to the Reform movement, which has said, no, like the law itself is not eternal. What's eternal is ethical monotheism. The law was relevant for a particular time and place, and can be modified, or parts of it can be jettisoned when they're no longer relevant. But there's also, I think, beyond an assertion that, we got the Torah before we had a land, the Torah is what defines us as a people. This also says something about his notion of Jewish peoplehood. So it shouldn't be surprising, right? That Rav Shlomo Hirsch was not a supporter of the proto-Zionism that existed in his day, because that's an irrelevant Zionism for him. He was still anachronistic to speak of Zionism, but the Chovevei Tzion movement, which did exist in his lifetime, he would have seen it, which was the movement that first began, to settle Jews in agricultural villages and settlements in Eretz Yisrael. It's irrelevant. What is that solving? What problem is that solving? Nothing. Doesn't solve anything for him. And this also explains one of the most controversial and significant sort of endeavors that he engaged in, which was this notion of Austritt. Austritt was a piece of legislation that he was able to, it happened first in Hungary, and then it happened in Germany, which was as Jews were emancipated in these countries, there was all these countries had, many of them still have state churches which are supported by tax money. And if you were Jewish, your tax money wouldn't go to the state church, it would go to the Jewish community. So the Jewish community, all the institutions of the Jewish community were supported by government money, which was paid for by taxes collected from the community of each religion. So in Germany, there was a Catholic church supported by tax money, there was a Protestant church supported by tax money, and there was a Jewish community supported by tax money. But in Samuel Hirsch's time, the Jewish community was dominated by Reform Jews. And he was able to get passage through the German parliament of a law that allowed Jews to secede from the Jewish community and form their own separatist Orthodox community. And Rav Samuel Hirsch felt it was an obligation to do so. It was forbidden for an Orthodox Jew to remain a member of a Jewish community that was dominated by Reform Jews. And I think you see that. I mean, he wrote a lot about this. He spoke a lot about this. And I could have brought, many, many texts that kind of speak to that, to why he thought that was important. I think this paragraph in a very succinct way sums it. If the whole point of Jewish peoplehood is our connection to the Torah, then what value is there? What do we have in common of being, in any communal sense, of being connected to Jews who don't share our understanding of what allegiance to Torah means? And so he pushed through Austritt in the parliament, and he told his community, you have to secede, you have to withdraw from the organized Jewish community and affiliate instead with a separate Orthodox community. This didn't work, actually. Most German Jews, even his community of Frankfurt, did not secede from the organized Jewish community. The major reason why they didn't want to do that was, anyone know or care to guess? What kept them in the broader Jewish community? David? Family? Be more specific. What about their family?
They would have relatives that are part of the broader Jewish community.
And that would therefore...
Well, and they'd want to go to their simchas and they...
So you could go to the simchas. Why couldn't you go to the simchas if you withdraw from them, right? It was the cemeteries, okay? These communities owned cemeteries, and these cemeteries, people lived in the same cities, same communities for generations at a time. You could have families in Frankfurt that had been there for centuries, and all buried in the same cemetery, and all the community's institutions are split in two, or groups of seeds. They have to have their own cemetery, their own synagogue, their own hospitals, their own nursing homes, own orphanages. All of the institutions the Jewish community provided had to be separated out. And so most Orthodox Jews did not actually follow Septuagint Hirsch. They were called Gemeinde Orthodox Jews. They were part of the general Jewish community. But he had a group of followers who did separate. In Hungary also. Hungary, more of the Orthodox Jews did separate. Hungary, there were actually three groups. There were the Neologues, who were, maybe today we would call them conservative Reform Jews, who dominated the national Jewish organization. There were the separate Orthodox, national organization. There were some communities that refused to join either organization. They called themselves status quo communities. And the status quo communities were also ostracized by the Orthodox leadership. And there are Shailot and Shuvot, there's halachic literature from 19th century Hungary about whether you can, trust a kosher butcher who also serves as a chazan at a shul, which is a status quo shul. Which is so interesting, because the status quo shul, nothing changed. It's the same shul with the same leadership and the same minhagim as has existed generation after generation. But all of a sudden you have these national organizations that are breaking up on denominational lines, and one community decides we don't want to divide our communal institutions into two. We'll just keep things as they are. But that was considered a betrayal of Orthodoxy. That's Jacob Katz has a very interesting book on that, on this whole question, called, in English it's called A House Divided. Very, very worthwhile book if this history interests you. But as a history of ideas or as a piece of religious ideology, I think the point is very clear. That Jewish peoplehood means nothing without the Torah, and so if there's a group of Jews who don't share in a fundamental way our connection to Torah, we have nothing in common with them. And so we can't partner with them in any Jewish communal affairs. Jewish communities have to be led by Orthodox Jews, and Orthodox Jews can only be part of Jewish communities that are led by Orthodox Jews. And this, even though the majority of German Jews didn't adopt this stance, and we have a tshuva from the Netziv in Eastern Europe who rejected this, it wasn't necessary. This is the stance today of I would say, the Agudat Yisrael Haredi stance in America, which doesn't affiliate with non-Orthodox Jewish organizations. There's some here and there, greater or lesser partnership in certain ways, with federation and with Jewish defense organizations, but fairly minimal. And it comes from this ouster position, which I think has become the Haredi stance. In 1956, I have here there was a letter that appeared in Jewish newspapers signed by 11 Roshei Yeshiva, 11 Orthodox leaders of the time, including Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Hutner and Rosh Feinstein and Ron Cutler, the great Roshei Yeshiva of the time. The letter said, we've been asked by a number of rabbis in the country and by alumni and musmachim of yeshivas if it is permissible to participate with and be a member of the New York Board of Rabbis and similar groups in other communities which are composed of Reform and Conservative rabbis, quote-unquote rabbis. Having gathered together to clarify this matter, it has been ruled by the undersigned that it is forbidden by the law of our sacred Torah to be a member of and to participate in such an organization. We have also been asked if it is permissible to participate with and to be a member of the Synagogue Council of America, which is also composed of Reform and Conservative organizations. We have ruled that it is forbidden by the law of our sacred Torah to participate with them either as an individual or as an organized communal body. May Hashem Yisbarach have mercy on his people and seal the breaches in Torah life, and may we be worthy of the elevation of the glory of our sacred Torah and our people. Israel signed this 5th week of the the 5th day, the week of Parshas Kitisa, the 18th day of Adar 5716 in the city of New York. So a whole group of people did sign this letter. One who did not sign that letter was Rav Soloveitchik, who did not sign. And the whole series of scholars on why he didn't sign the letter. The most basic reason why he didn't sign the letter is because he didn't agree with the letter. And we'll look at this next section, section 2.
Was he asked to sign the letter?
That's also part of the whole flinter. He was, Eliezer Silver, though, was asked to sign the letter and didn't. Rav Soloveitchik, it's a question. Was he asked? Was he not asked? It's a lot of history, revisionist history on his relationship to this letter. So Kol Todi Dofek is an essay that he wrote. The main point of this essay it was a discourse he gave to the Mizrahi, to the religious Zionist organization. This is his articulation of a religious Zionist worldview. But it's also an articulation of Jewish peoplehood. It's many things. It's also an essay about the Holocaust. It's a very powerful essay. It's worth reading. And he says, he lays out 2 different responses to tragedy, 2 different responses to history, 2 different ways of being in the world, responding to life and things that happen in life. One is the mode of fate, and the other is the mode of destiny. And he says, fate is what happens to you without being chosen on your part. Okay. The God of the Hebrews does not wait for man to search for him, to freely invite him into his presence. He imposes his rule over man against his will. A Jew cannot expel the God of the Hebrews from his private domain. He serves the God of the Hebrews against his will. If boiling water is poured upon the head of a Jew of Morocco, the fashionably attired Jew in Paris or London has to scream at the top of his voice, and through feeling the pain, he will remain faithful to his people. We have stated that it is the consciousness of the fate imposed upon the people against their will and of their terrible isolation that is the source of the people's unity, of their togetherness. That's called the covenant of fate. Fate, again, is what is imposed on you by history against your will. That's suffering, anti-Semitism, that's going through history as a Jew, and that collective identity that's forced upon you. It is precisely this consciousness as the source of the people's togetherness that gives rise to the attribute of chesed, kindness, charity, right, which summons and stirs the community of fate to achieve a positive mode of togetherness through ongoing joint participation in its own historical circumstances, in its suffering, conscience, and acts of mutual aid. And I think this is true, okay? Like this awareness of combating anti-Semitism and standing up and helping Jews in danger around the world, that is a common fate that does unite us regardless of ideology. The lonely Jew finds consolation in breaking down the existential barriers of egoism and alienation, joining himself to his fellow and actively connecting himself with a community. The oppressive sense of fate undergoes a positive transformation when individual personal existences blend together to form a new unit of people. The obligation to love one another stems from the consciousness of this people of fate, this lonely people that inquires into the meaning of its own uniqueness. It is this obligation of love that stands at the very heart of the covenant made in Egypt, right? In Egypt, we became a people not because we affirmed a common religious vision. We became a people in Egypt because we suffered together. We shared a common fate. He calls it the Brit Goral, the covenant of fate. No choice, no ideology, no religious passion, just we all suffered together, we all as Jews, and therefore a common national collective identity as Jews was formed. However, destiny in the life of a people, as in the life of an individual, signifies a deliberate and conscious existence that the people has chosen out of its own free will and in which it finds the full realization of its historical being. So that's destiny. Fate is what happens to you, not by choice. Destiny is what we together choose of our own free will. The congregation is a holy nation that has no fear of fate and is not compelled to live against its will. It believes in its own destiny, and it dedicates itself out of its own free will to the realization of that destiny. The covenant in Egypt was made with a people born from a camp, a machaneh. The covenant at Sinai was made with a holy nation. The Am Chesed, the people of loving kindness, was raised on high and became a goy kadosh, a holy nation. Holiness, which expresses itself in the form of an authentic mode of being, is the very foundation of the shared destiny of a nation. Our historic obligation today is to raise ourselves from a people to a holy nation, from the covenant of Egypt to the covenant of Sinai, from an existence of necessity to an authentic way of life, suffused with eternal ethical and religious values, from a camp to a congregation. So clearly, there's a hierarchy, and clearly the covenant of destiny is at the top of that hierarchy. Having a shared, common religious vision, that's the goal. That has to be the goal. That's what it's about. We go from Egypt to Sinai, from the covenant of fate to the covenant of destiny. But even without that covenant of destiny, there is that primal foundation of a common bond that unites us because we have a common faith. And he says the task confronting the religious Shivat Sion movement is to achieve the great union of the two covenants, Egypt and Sinai, fate and destiny, isolation and solitude. Okay, so it's that's the goal. That, like, Zionism is a recognition of Jewish peoplehood. Religious Zionism is infusing Zionism not just with that commonality of peoplehood and common faith, but giving a destiny to the Jewish people by representing the Torah and promoting the Torah as a common destiny for the Jewish people. But, he argues, religious Jews can participate in the Zionist movement because we do have that common destiny of faith that connects us to Jews with whom we don't share a religious ideology. Reactions, comments? Marilyn.
I wanted to go back to the beginning.
Go back to the beginning.
I don't think that conservative Judaism started in the 1940s. I think it started before then.
So the early histories of the conservative movement that they wrote claimed that their movement goes back to the Wissenschaft des Judentum movement in Germany in the 19th century, and Salman Schechter, etc. But in the better histories that have been written in the last several years, and have convinced, I haven't read the books, but I've read reviews of the books, and they convinced me, is that the conservative movement didn't, as a distinct movement from Orthodoxy, that people actually knew what you were talking about. That there was, Orthodoxy was one thing, and conservative Judaism was something else, and these were categories which had boundaries that you couldn't necessarily easily cross. That didn't happen until the 1940s. They were graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary before then who served as rabbis in Orthodox congregations, for example, right? And you had Orthodox congregations that would have candidates, rabbinic candidates from Yeshiva University and from JTS, and they were sorting that out. And that was until the late 1940s that the kind of boundaries between the movements divided. You had different rabbinic organizations, different synagogue organizations, different rabbinical schools, and once you had those elements of distinct movements, then you can speak of a movement having a distinct identity. So that would be the, but many conservative Jews like to trace the origins of the movement back to these earlier institutions that existed in Europe.
I was born in 1941 on the west side of Chicago, and we belonged to a traditional shul, as distinct from the Orthodox and distinct from the conservative.
Yeah, so the traditional movement, that was like a Midwestern thing that was very, very popular in the 40s and 50s. It sort of hasn't done so well since then.
No,
but that speaks to, I think, also this time when the boundaries were not so distinct. And as the boundaries became distinct, I think the traditional movement, their moment was to say, well, we're going to blend, we're going to blur that boundary. Everywhere else in the country, Orthodoxy and conservative Judaism are solidifying into two distinct things. We're going to try to straddle that divide. And that worked for some time. Yes?
I'm just musing about these two pieces. So Soloveitchik is certainly more encompassing the whole as he begins his discussion. But he ends up really in the same places as Hirsch does, in the sense of it's my way or the highway kind of thing. There's only one way of doing this. So in practice, was there any difference between?
So that's a great point. So the answer is yes. So let's sort of play that. Is there a difference between Shem Shmuel Hirsch's, the quote we saw, where again, Judaism is defined only by the Torah, and therefore we have nothing in common. That's the difference, so right? Shem Shmuel Hirsch is saying that's the quote I brought here, source one. He's saying there is no meaning to Jewish peoplehood without the Torah. And so if we don't share a connection to the Torah, we share nothing. So the Veitchik is saying, no, there's something called the covenant of fate. We share a common bond with all Jews because the world treats us the same. History treats us the same. God treats us the same through history. And we have that common, and we're in Egypt together, and we formed one people in Egypt. So that's something that connects all Jews. Some of us, accepted the Torah also, and we have that bond amongst those of us who accepted the Torah. So the question is, what's the meaning? So what practical nafka would it be? So one, so the Veitchik didn't sign the letter saying you can't join the New York Board of Rabbis. And we'll play, yeah? And he supports Zionism. He also supports Zionism. That's another very important one, right? Florina.
Yeah, those are completely opposite views.
Opposite view, yeah.
Yeah, because Soloveitchik is saying that we're defined by external forces. So
We're also defined by external forces.
But yeah, so basically it doesn't matter if you observe anything, as long as someone's going to be, if there's anti-Semitism, it's going to affect you the same as someone else.
Correct.
Brady. So that's external, so literally being defined by external forces, whereas for Hirsch, it's you choose
Correct.
what you're going to follow, and that's what defines you. It's like,
yes, the similarity is that neither one of them is pluralist, right? They're not saying there are multiple ways of being Jewish and they're both equally valid. They're not saying that, absolutely. So we'll have to, yes, that is for certainly true. Rachel.
I'm bringing up that, but I seem to remember hearing that Rabbi Soloveitchik wasn't actually super keen on other denominations of Judaism.
Let's look at the source 3. This is a letter in a Yiddish newspaper. There's a wonderful book, Community, Covenant, and Commitment, that my teacher, Natty Helfgott, edited a few years ago. It's a collection of Soloveitchik's letters about communal matters, spanning several decades. It's a wonderful book. It's so good I lent it to somebody because it had something I really wanted him to see, and I don't remember who it was, and he never gave the book back to me, so I no longer own it. And that copy had notes and everything, but it's a really good book. So, any event, he writes in this Yiddish paper. The conclusion above is very simple. When we are faced with a problem for Jews and Jewish interests toward the world without, regarding the defense of Jewish rights in the non-Jewish world, then all groups and movements must be united. In this area, there may not be any division because any friction in the Jewish camp may be disastrous for the entire people. In this realm, we must consider the ideal of unity as a political, historical nation, which includes everyone from Mendes France to the old-fashioned Jew of Mea Shearim, without exception. In the crematoria, the ashes of the Hasidim and pious Jews were put together with the ashes of the radicals and the atheists, and we all must fight the enemy who does not differentiate between those who believe in God and those who reject him. With regard to our problem within, however, our spiritual religious interests, such as Jewish education, synagogues, councils of rabbis, whereby unity is expressed through spiritual, ideological collectivism as a Torah community, it is my opinion that Orthodoxy cannot and should not unite with such groups which deny the fundamentals of our Weltanschauung. It is impossible for me to comprehend, for example, how Orthodox rabbis who spent their best years in yeshivot and absorbed the spirit of the oral law and its tradition, for whom Rabbi Akiva, Maimonides, Rav Moshe Isserles, and the Gaon of Vilna, Rav Chaim Brisker, and other Jewish sages are the pillars upon which their spiritual world rests, can join with spiritual leaders for whom all this is worthless. A rabbinical organization is not a professional fraternity which fights for the economic interests of the rabbi. It is an ideological entity where members work for one purpose and one ideal. The fundamental difference in ideology and observance makes such a unity impossible. Too much harmony and peace can cause confusion of the minds and will erase outwardly the boundaries between Orthodoxy and the other movements. Reactions. Rachel?
Well, in the last one, he just said that we should join with all Jews to create a society for Jews, which seems to be sort of an internal thing. And now he's saying we can't join with other Jews to create an internal peaceful community because that will lead to the dissolving of everything that's meaningful.
Yeah, Ken? Yeah.
I think he's saying both. In source 3, he's saying non-Orthodox Jews need to join with Orthodox Jews to all be Orthodox. So that's his ultimate goal. He's saying that the ultimate goal is to have one community inwardly, internally, and that's the way that should happen, rather than just learning.
I'm not sure. No.
Well, I think the reason he says that has to happen, or that's what he's saying, is because
need to have this community of destiny, and it's the Orthodox community that's accepted this congregation, this notion.
Yeah, so I think in source 2, in Kol Dafek, he's saying, we already share this covenant of fate, and that's the basis for our involvement in the Zionist project. And then the goal of religious Zionism is to convince others to see things our way and to also add onto that the covenant of destiny, but through the Torah. So I think that's sort of an aspirational sort of vision of this is how we think of ourselves as religious Zionists taking part in the Zionist project. What are we doing? What's our contribution? Well, we're trying to bring the spirit to, it's like the Mafdal, and their old election ads, and Mafdal, the Mafdal gives, a soul to the state, right? And that was the song, so that I think that's bring that on, add that to this secular or faith-based identity, yeah?
So it seems like what he's saying is Jews should, of all walks of life, should join together to create a society so it can prove to the world, whatever, that we're not worth fighting with or killing or, the point is to protect ourselves from the world.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of constructing a society that works for our own purposes,
right.
like the ultra-Orthodox and the
Okay.
conservative can actually join together.
Good. So this this is reminiscent. If you recall, I don't know if you were there when we talked about interfaith dialogue. Soloveitchik articulates a very somewhat similar stance where he says Jews and when it comes to issues of society and poverty and war, and we should work together with our Christian neighbors to better the world in secular ways, but we should not talk about this sort of certain types of theological discussions we shouldn't take part in. And then he has a footnote where he says, well, of course, the distinction between the secular and the religious is a meaningless distinction for someone who's religious. Which the footnote kind of undermines the whole distinction he's based. So what does it mean? How are we supposed to? And that's the class they asked us to. Some religious Zionist thinker was asked, "What's the greatest religious crisis facing modern Israel?" And he said, "Well, it's the gap between rich and poor." No, not the economic crisis. I asked you, "What's the religious?" No, that is the great religious crisis. Is the gap between rich and poor? What's a secular kind of concern that we cooperate and negotiate and talk with all Jews about, and what is a spiritual issue that we... So I would say there are gray areas, but gray areas don't mean that distinctions don't exist, right? Just because there's gray doesn't mean black and white don't also exist. So I think there are some gray areas, but I think the examples he gives in this, a rabbinic organization, or a rabbinic board where rabbis are going to study Torah together and sort of issue statements about faith. That's something which I imagine he would frown upon. That is what he's, I think, condemning in this, like an interdenominational rabbinic organization. He's condemning in this letter. That does, which seems that's in one category, where even though there are some gray areas, like especially in the context of Israel, where it's not so easy to categorize things internal versus external. Is that a fair response to your question?
Yeah, it is a fair response. I'm just not convinced he's right.
That is totally fair. Linda.
Well, what's disturbing me is how dismissive he is of anyone who is not on the same page that he's on. And without allowing for any kind of shadings, so they're all dismissive of all of our greats,
Great.
Good.
Yeah, wait. With all this is worthless.
And yet within the society of people, from rabbis, there are still ongoing arguments, and there's still
right. Oh, right, right.
So there is, I guess, the sense that there's an appreciation of those arguments, but just being dismissive and not having an appreciation.
So three. That's great. That's great, and that's a perfect segue to source 4. But before that, just remember that's a perfect segue to source 4 because I want to point out 4 things in this source 3 that I think are worth sort of. Maybe sort of how you might respond to this, or some ground to kind of form a reaction. 1, he says, "It is my opinion that Orthodoxy can and should not unite." Right. So that's something Rabbi Soloveitchik was really known for, that he expressed his opinion, but he also famously, notoriously, encouraged his students to think for themselves and make their own decisions. And he had students who joined interdenominational rabbinic boards, and he knew that, and he. It didn't bother him that his students disagreed with him at times, and he fostered that great diversity of opinion and practice among the students. That's one point. That's sort of, and you see it right here. It says my opinion. I think that's, for him, that meant more than it meant for many others, because he was quite encouraging of his students and demanded that his students think for themselves and make decisions for themselves. Next, you pointed out, the non-Orthodox rabbis room, all this is worthless. So that's a very, very strong statement. It's hyperbolic, or maybe it was true of his experiences in 1954, but maybe it's certainly, I don't think it's true today, certainly. Next, he says rabbinic organization is not a professional fraternity, but a rabbinic organization could also be a professional fraternity. There is a value in having a professional fraternity. I know some rabbis, a rabbi I know who's very dismissive, extremely dismissive of non-Orthodox Judaism and non-Orthodox clergy in all sorts of ways, but he also speaks very openly of the fact that he befriended the local Reform rabbi in his town, who was extremely helpful to him during some professional challenges, and that is also a value. The other piece at the end, that if there's too much confusion, it'll erase the boundaries in Orthodoxy and other movements. That to me is very much a product of 1954, when most objective observers did not think that Orthodoxy would exist in another generation. Orthodoxy was the era when Orthodoxy was hemorrhaging membership. And the future was, 1954 was the conservative movement, and the boundaries were not clear in membership, in terms of observance, in terms of there was no, Orthodoxy was very, very weak, and I think this statement speaks to, speaking from a place of weakness and insecurity. Source 4 is a letter to the president of one of the local conservative synagogue in the Boston area. So the Beit, in addition to teaching in New York, he was a community rabbi in Boston. So he was invited to the shul dinner, okay? So, I cherish my long association with Rabbi Subo, and I consider him a dear and distinguished friend whom I hold in great esteem because of his many talents and fine qualities. It is self-evident that if the dinner were being given only in honor of Rabbi Mr. Shubo, I would consider it a privilege to serve as one of the sponsors. On the other hand, however, this reception, to my regret, will also serve as an occasion to celebrate the completion and dedication of the new temple. Let me say unequivocally that I do recognize the importance of this new house of worship for the Jewish population of Brighton as a means of communal organization and unification. I also appreciate the unselfish efforts on the part of the members and leaders which make such an undertaking possible. Their pride in having attained their goal is fully warranted. You in particular have manifested a strong sense of community awareness and devotion for Jewish causes, for which you should be congratulated. Okay, so this is his why, but I can't go to this dinner. So, what do you make of this letter? Ever got a letter like that? What would you think of the letter?
I don't think he said he couldn't go. He said he wouldn't be on the committee.
Right, I think
it wouldn't be a sponsor.
Would be a sponsor. I think you have to pay. I don't think he went. Or maybe he went and said hello. He's not. He can't pay. Well, even he's not being a sponsor. He can't pay money to. He's not going. He's not willing to pay money to support the operations of this conservative synagogue. He doesn't feel his name can't be associated as endorsing the synagogue. He doesn't want to. And yet first of all, he does consider. I don't remember, sorry, it's Subo Shuba, it's spelled differently, it's one of them. This rabbi is a dear friend, a respected colleague, has a lot of admiration for him, and he has admiration for this new building. This new building is a positive thing, it's good for the Jews, it's great for Brighton, this is wonderful. I just can't, go, okay?
He's sort of a wonderful politician.
It's a political, okay.
Because he's not insulting.
He's not really trying hard not to insult, but yeah.
It's almost like the rabbi last week saying,
There's nothing wrong with that, I just can't, yeah, right. Ellen?
I think also the letter is devoid of any halachic or Torah tone or mention. Instead, it's completely secularization of organizational theory.
Yes, correct. Right. It's not. Yeah, this is not a halachic letter. This is a. I don't know if Philip Fleischer understood halachic language, but he. It's very interesting. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely consistent with what he said previously, but which is, I support the fact that you have this as a community center, but, I'm not willing to participate in it, insofar as it would give my stamp of approval to what you're doing religiously.
Right.
I think I don't understand how this would actually work, practically speaking, because, like, he also says that, that unity is an ideal and that any friction or division is disastrous to the whole. So I don't see practically how it would work where Jews would be entirely unified in one sense.
Good. So when Rav Bamberger, the Würzburger Rav, rejected Semper Hirsch's position of Auschwitz, he said Orthodox Jews can remain part of the Gemeinde as long as we have independence for kashrut and our shuls and and our mikvahs. As long as we can, our religious institutions can operate independently and we have autonomy, we can pay our dues to the general operating. So we can donate to federation, we can be Zionists and support the Zionist project and take part part in Jewish defense organizations, etc. We just can't. Religious things, we have to go our own separate path. So maybe that doesn't work, because maybe if you don't show up at I don't know, did the friendship survive this? There's also a story that Rabbi Saul Berman tells, which I'm going to get the details a little bit. There was a young woman who was going to marry a Kohen, and her mother was a convert. And we didn't, and the details of the conversion of the Beit that converted this woman's mother were unknown. And because the woman wanted to marry a Kohen, you couldn't just, the bride, you couldn't just, well, who knows, let's just, go to the mikveh and convert just in case, because then she couldn't marry, a convert can't marry a Kohen. So it was really important to verify the validity of the conversion of the mother. The mother and father were married by a Reform rabbi in the Boston area. Rabbi Berman consulted Rav Soloveitchik about this case, who told, if it's Rabbi Schwartz, or if Rabbi Schwartz said he did, the wedding, then it's totally fine, because he would never do a wedding unless both couples were totally Jewish or had an Orthodox conversion. That was his policy. Even as a Reform rabbi, that was his policy. And you can trust the testimony of this Reform rabbi, his halachic, his aegis, his testimony about the Jewish status of this couple, you can rely on and do the wedding. And that Reform rabbi, I think, died like a week later, and the wedding went through, and it was like, it's amazing, so he's not, that to me, that's sort of, again, that's sort of like the great, his integrity as a rabbi is relied upon for this extremely sensitive halachic case. I think that's interesting. Yes?
Did he put it in writing?
No.
I mean, I heard a very similar kind of story. It's not similar, but that somebody I knew heard this directly from Soloveitchik, that one of his students came to Soloveitchik and said, I learned on my mother's deathbed from my mother that my father was not the person I always thought was my father, but I was a product of an adulterous affair on the part of my mother.
Wow.
And he came to Soloveitchik shortly before his own wedding.
Wow.
And the issue being that if he was a mamzer, he would not be able to be married. And Soloveitchik simply said, there aren't two witnesses.
Yeah. That's actually pretty.
The issue.
Yeah. That's a standard. That's actually a standard. You're not allowed to self-incriminate yourself in halakha. So the testimony of the mother in that way is not. We'll talk about that when we talk about torture next semester in the class. And so you can't self-incriminate yourself in halakha. So that's look, he had a lot. He didn't write as much about halakha. But look, I have this tradition now from Rabbi Berman, and you heard it from me. And this is this is also part of the legacy of who he was and what his positions. Others. Okay. Let's look a little bit farther. Okay, source 5. This is something I read and translated this directly from an essay by Professor Ravitsky. I've subsequently found it in Rav Kook himself, which I brought to you as Professor Ravitsky has kind of excerpted it. But if you want, I can trace this back in Rav Kook's own writings. And he writes that there are 3 major ideological movements that were fighting for primacy amongst the Jewish people. There was Orthodoxy, New Nationalism, and Liberalism In his words, each of these movements or trends made a spiritual claim and represented a different positive attribute. The first trend, Orthodoxy, represents classic Jewish religious tradition. It carries the banner of the holy, makes claims with audacity and with eagerness and with zeal on behalf of Torah and mitzvot, faith, and all that is holy in Israel. The second trend, New Nationalism, fights for the renewal of Israel in its land. It strives to actualize the yearning and the natural inclination of the nation, which have been silenced within the nation by the heavy hand of exile. The third trend, liberalism, brings into the camp of Israel universal humanist ideals. It cannot be contained within the national group and seeks the human components of enlightenment, culture, and ethics. What I find so helpful about this piece of Rav Kook is that instead of a binary system, which we've seen until now, of, we share a worldview or we don't, actually there are, in his, taxonomy, 3 different ideas, and they're all actually representing something true. And the question that we're faced with is not who's right and who's wrong. The question is, how do we incorporate the insights of all of these different trends or movements or philosophies into some holistic whole that's going to, right? Because Orthodoxy is necessary. It's carrying the banner of tradition and Torah and mitzvot and Kedusha. And nationalism is also important because it's leading the push for the revival of the Jewish people in its land. And liberalism is also important because it recognizes that ethics are universal and we have to care about all humanity, and God cares about all humanity equally. And all of these ideas have to somehow be mushed together into a synthesis. And Rav Kook's project was about that synthesis of the new and the old, the holy and the profane. And I think with this way of thinking, I think it allows us to think about other kinds of Jews. Rather than, we share Jewish people who we disagree about the Torah, we can say, no, actually, if there are, when you go to, when you mix paints, each of the paint colors is they're all it's all different proportions of the primary colors. So you have nationalism, traditionalism, and liberalism, and it's just a question of how much we mix the different elements and ingredients. And so I can see a Reform Jew and say, you're just prioritizing the universal at the expense of the national and the traditional, but the values that you're living your life by, I also share those values. You're just mixing the paint a little bit differently. And I can see a secular Zionist and say, you're downplaying the traditional and you're emphasizing the national, but that's a value I share also. And I see that, and I think it opens up the possibility of more conversations and different kinds of conversations and different types of interactions than is possible in, let's say, the sort of position that Soloveitchik articulates, or that certainly Rav Hirsch articulates. And this, I think, is there in Rav Kook, and I think it's, I think you see that in the way the religious Zionist community has been able to, without being particularly pluralist in their worldview, but a really full interaction in Israeli society and all of its levels and all of its institutions. Another, that's one sort of synthesis in the sense that, approach. That's a next step, moving beyond these dichotomies of the 1950s. Source 6 is an essay that Nadia Helfgott wrote, sort of retrospective, right? On the shoulder of a giant looking back at looking forward. These comments of the Rav generally have been read as indicating that in the realm of the covenant of faith, we share nothing in common with our secular or heterodox brethren. Our connection, a powerful one though it is exclusively in the realm of the covenant of fate, in our physical and historical bond to every Jew throughout the world as a member of the extended family. We saw this, okay? And is this bond which impels us to work together, shoulder to shoulder, with the secularists in Israel and the diaspora. Upon reflection, though, this formulation strikes me as excessively narrow. Is it really true that we share nothing in common with our secular Zionists or Reform and conservative co-religionists in central areas of our religious, spiritual, and moral existence? Even if we do differ on cardinal areas, and these should not be minimized, are there not other areas where the differences reflect shared goals but differing means? Okay, shared goals but differing means, that is also reminiscent echoes of the Rav Kook in Source 5. Indeed, no less a towering figure than Rav Aaron Lichtenstein has intimated such an approach in numerous published writings in the last 2 decades. And here's a quote from Rav Lichtenstein, which has been published in other venues subsequently. Orthodoxy cannot accord secularists or dissenters the hechsher they so incessantly demand. We can, however, place greater emphasis upon the factors that, which, without denying difference, transcend it. Upon confraternity, upon historical and existential ties, upon essential components of a shared, a shared moral and spiritual vision, upon elements of both a common fate and a common destiny. Okay, so here he's explicitly echoing the language of Soloveitchik in Kol Dodi Dofek, and is saying binary is not so simple. We can find elements of a shared religious vision. There are elements of a shared destiny as well as a common fate that connect us to other Jews. And so it's explicitly transcending that division that Soloveitchik lays out in a very neat way. In 1954, Rabbi Lichtenstein, his son-in-law, is transcending that distinction, is saying a synthesis is possible. Again, he's not a pluralist, and he's saying we can't give them a hechsher. We can't say that these expressions of Judaism are equally legitimate or equally authentic or authentic at all. We can't give them that legitimacy, but we can recognize there's a common ethical vision, a common moral vision, a common connection to Torah even, right? Something really substantial, not just confraternity and peoplehood, etc. Thoughts about that before we... Rachel?
I think that he is getting, so I think that Rav Soloveitchik maybe was a little bit too quick to draw dichotomies between Orthodox Jews and all other Jews. And I think that Rav Lichtenstein is getting to something that there are some common values, but there are certain things that you can't reconcile and you can't give extra to other people. So, given that, I think we still have to deal with the problem that Rav Soloveitchik lays out, which is, I don't think that discounts Rav Soloveitchik, because the fact that there are differences between sects of Judaism,
Right.
Still...
It doesn't solve any practical questions. So you ask Rav Lichtenstein, can I join the Interdenominational Board of Rabbis? I should know. I don't know what he says. I'm sure people ask him that all the time. I don't know what he says. He has students who do. He has students who don't. I don't know what his actual, if he has a stated position. He might actually say, he doesn't like to get into internal American questions of that sort. Right. It doesn't. Just having that formulation doesn't solve any of the hard questions of what do we do with them, what do we do separately. It doesn't solve any of that, but it does give you a different way of framing it. Allows you to kind of to soften some of the very sort of sharp lines that Soloveitchik was drawing in 1954. Again, the lines don't maybe need to be quite as sharp because the Orthodoxy is in a position of strength relative to how it was in 1954. Linda?
I think what also happens in his way is that he softens, he's not dismissive of the other. And where Soloveitchik allowed for a common fate that was imposed from the outside, he's allowing for an understanding of Torah, an understanding and appreciation of Jewish text or whatever that is not Orthodox, but has the commonality and it's a forward-moving kind of thing. So it's not imposed from outside. It's gotten from our tradition. So it's not Orthodox, so it can't be. You can't give the hechsher, that kind of thing. But it's not dismissive in the way that it's moving, and it's not.
It's a very, and Rav Lichtenstein expand this into a larger essay, which is worth reading. I agree. It's helpful. I think sometimes the more respectful, sometimes sharp lines make it easier, to be. I sometimes feel it's better to, it's a restaurant with a conservative hechsher. I'm just not going to eat it. I don't want to, because the alternative is to then question and scrutiny, and judge and, what's your position on what kind of cheese to use? What this, I thought, is that respectful? Is that more respectful than I'm going to ask those kind of questions? Maybe just say your religious worldview has its own integrity from within itself, and it's just not mine. And so I'm not going to sort of engage in the type of investigations I would have to in order to eat in the restaurant with a conservative hechsher. Maybe just more respectful, maybe to kind of. Just you have your way of seeing things, you have your worldview, you have your, So I think there's sometimes it can be helpful to have firm boundaries, but I fundamentally agree that Rav Lichtenstein sort of is in softening those boundaries. It is a more inclusive way of speaking about other people, which I which I personally appreciate. I think resonates and seems very true to me, and true to my experience, as well. Two other quick ideas. I don't want to keep you late. We started a little bit late, which was my fault, so I don't feel I deserve it. Can't keep you late, but two quick ideas I'll just say. Three ideas, very quickly. One, source 7 you have, this is Rabbi David Hartman, who is suggesting that Zionism represents the possibility of creating a new Brit Yehud, that we can form a new covenant of destiny as this diverse Jewish people, all of us together. And that it's not, like fate is Egypt and destiny is Sinai, and that means one thing and one thing only for all time. But no, like we now have the chance, right? The presence of a living Jewish society in Israel with its dedication to Brit Goral constitutes a fruitful soil for the creation of such a community of meaning. So he thinks it's possible for Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. He thought it was possible, to build something together that is sort of new and different and transcends our differences. And that's one sort of, I think, very sort of important voice and a different approach to this entire question. Another approach to this entire question is a sort of true religious pluralism of the type that Rabbi Greenberg has been advocating for the last 40 or 50 years, which has very little traction within the Orthodox community, but he's a powerful voice, and true religious pluralism, in which you sort of, you don't say my way is more legitimate or more authentic than yours. You'd say no, like all of our denominations are authentic responses to the call of God. They're authentic ways of the tradition living itself out in modern times, and therefore we can't really judge your perspective. If we want to keep this project of Jewish peoplehood alive, we have to recognize that these other denominations are authentic ways that is happening, and our judging them isn't fair, isn't appropriate, or isn't right, and that leads to a whole other way of sort of thinking through these questions and much more affirming interdenominational cooperation. And even so far, I think Rabbi Greenberg, I think he advocates very, very open to example, for some of the really sensitive issues of personal status, very open to accepting, conversions that have been under the auspices of Reform and conservative rabbis, because he feels like, I think he has written to this effect that, these are serious people who are authentically, legit, with real sincerity interpreting Judaism in a way that seems right for them, and if we take Jewish peoplehood seriously, we have to respect their right to kind of engage in that, just as, the state of, if I have a driver's license from Illinois, I can drive in Texas, so if a Reform rabbi gives you a driver's license, so I have to respect that too. I think that's the sort of, you wouldn't give that metaphor is mine, but I think that's how, I think he's said as much. And the final point, I feel kind of embarrassed that I did this, that I quoted a paragraph that I wrote myself in a Rosh Hashanah drasha 2 years ago, but it sort of sums up part of how I feel. This stance of fear that was, I think, animating some of the earlier sources. When Rosh Hashanah Hirsch was writing, there was real antagonism towards tradition on the part of Reform rabbis. They were real anti-traditional, anti-Talmud, anti-Orthodox stance was very, very strong. And in 1954, when Soloveitchik was writing, you had also Orthodoxy was on the ropes. Serious sociologists and scholars of religion wrote seriously, in essays, and Orthodoxy will disappear in another generation. And that was sort of clearly what was going to happen. And that's just different now. I think we can have the confidence to take, not that there aren't struggles or dangers, but I think we can afford the confidence to take some risks, and I think across the board, Reform conservative rabbis, they spent a year at Pardes, they love, they think that what we do is good, it's for whatever reason they're not Orthodox, but our way of learning Torah is authentic to them. It's the mark of authenticity to them. Our fluency with Jewish ritual is something they admire and aspire to. I think that means we can interact with them from a place of strength, from a place of confidence, in a respectful way, without some of the fears and hang-ups of earlier generations. I think that's it's a different. This just wasn't like that in 1954. Okay. Thank you for coming. We're going to break for Hanukkah and for winter vacation, people who travel and stuff. We reconvene in January with a series that I'm teaching. In February, we moved to Tuesdays in February.
Oh.
Professor Malka Simkovich is teaching 3 lectures in February, and then in March I'm coming back for another series. So thank you so much. Nothing in January. Yeah, you are doing January. Yeah, we are doing January. What'd you say? What?
When in January we start?
I think the 6th. I think the 6th. I think we have a minion from Arav if